Smoke first, then the smell of it, thick and bitter, rolling low across dry grass. A horse screamed somewhere in the dark. Fire climbed the side of a lodge like something alive, something hungry, eating hide and pine pole in long orange bites. Men shouted in a language that cracked and spat in the night air. A rifle went off, then another. Then a volley that sounded less like war and more like slaughter. A boy no older than 12 ran between two burning lodges, his arms empty, his mouth open in a scream that made no sound anyone could hear over the guns. An old man lay in the dirt with his chest opened up by a blade that had not been fired, but driven, twisted, driven again. A woman knelt over him. Not old, not young, big-boned and broad-shouldered in a way that made her look, in the firelight, like something carved rather than born. She pressed both hands flat against the wound, and the blood came up between her fingers black in the firelight. And she did not scream, and she did not run. She just pressed. Harder. Harder. Somewhere behind her, a rider on a pale horse turned his mount slow, unhurried, and looked back once at the wreckage she had made. He said something quiet to the man beside him. Then he rode on into the dark, and the fire kept climbing, and the woman kept pressing her hands to a wound that would not close. That was the night it started. Though no one, not the woman with the broad shoulders, not the dying man beneath her hands, not the rider on the pale horse, understood yet exactly what had been set in motion. 2 years later, a cattle spread outside a settlement called Coldwater Flat, in the high, dry country where the grass ran silver in the wind, and the mountains stood blue and far off on the horizon, like a promise nobody had gotten around to keeping. Her name was Odalys Marsh, though most folks in Coldwater Flat did not use her name if they could help it. They called her other things: the big woman, the giant. Sometimes, when they thought she could not hear or did not care if she could, they called her something crueler, something that had more to do with her size than her name. As if a body 6.5 feet tall with shoulders like a door frame was a thing to be mocked, rather than simply a thing that was. She had come to Coldwater Flat 4 years back with a wagon, a rifle, and enough grit to break sod that other men had taken one look at and called worthless. She had proved them wrong the hard way, the only way anybody in that country ever got proved wrong, by outlasting the land until it gave her what she wanted. Now she ran 40 head of cattle and kept a garden that put the town's own kitchen gardens to shame, and she did it alone, because that was how she had learned to do everything. Alone was safer. Alone did not laugh when you walked into a room and had to duck under the doorframe. Alone did not go quiet when you sat down at a supper table and the chair groaned under you. Alone did not flinch. She had stopped expecting anything else a long time ago. It was not bitterness, exactly. It had worn past bitterness into something calmer and colder, a kind of resignation that sat in her the way frost sits in the ground come November. Present, permanent, waiting. Every morning she rose before the sun, and she split wood before breakfast, not because she needed the exposure, but because the rhythm of it, swing, crack, swing, crack, was the only conversation she trusted not to hurt her. She had scars, not just the ones on her hands from rope burn and barbed wire. A scar along her jaw from a boy who'd thrown a rock when she was 11, aiming for the freak, the words the town had used before she was even old enough to understand what they meant by it. A deeper scar, unseen, in the place where a woman keeps the ordinary hopes, a home full of noise, a husband's hand at the small of her back, children underfoot, that she had folded up small and put away because the world had made it clear over and over that those hopes were not extended to a woman built like she was. She told herself it did not matter, She told herself this most days, usually around dusk, when the light went gold across the grass, and the loneliness came up in her chest like water finding a crack in a dam. It was Otis Kellerman, the mercantile owner, a gossiping but good-hearted man with a mustache too big for his face, who nudged the first stone that started everything sliding. "There's an Apache camp 2 valleys over," he told her one afternoon in early spring, while she was loading flour sacks onto her wagon. "Chief's been ailing. Word is he took a wound years back that never healed right. Doc Aldis rode out there once, wouldn't go back. Said the man was too far gone for any medicine he knew." Odalys had paused, sack in her arms, and something in her, some old, unused instinct, had turned toward the words like a compass needle finding north. "What kind of wound?" she asked. Otis shrugged, the way men do when they are more interested in the shape of a story than its facts. "Something to do with a raid, way back. Somebody's blade got him deep. Been rotting slow ever since, is what I hear. Doc says it's past fixing." She had set the flour down slow, and something old had stirred behind her ribs. Not hope, she would not have called it hope. She had trained herself out of hope the way you train a colt out of shying. But something adjacent to it. A memory of her mother's hands, before the fever took her, teaching a young Odalys how to pack a wound with yarrow and boiled cloth, how to read the color of skin around a bad cut, how to know the difference between a wound that would heal and one that would kill. She did not say anything more to Otis. She only nodded, took her flour, and rode home with the sun sinking gold behind her. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she did not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the rafters of her cabin, listening to the wind worry at the shingles, and she thought about a wound 2 valleys over that had been rotting for years. And she thought about her mother's hands, and somewhere near dawn, before she even fully understood she had decided anything, she found herself already packing a bag with clean cloth and dried herbs, and a jar of the honey she kept for burns. She did not yet know that the wound Otis described, a blade, a raid, years of slow rot, was the same wound that had opened in the firelight 2 years before, beneath the hands of a rider on a pale horse who had turned once to look at what he'd done before riding on into the dark. She did not yet know that the man dying 2 valleys over carried inside him not just a wound, but a debt, a name, a secret that a smooth-talking rancher 40 miles east had been counting on staying buried in that dying flesh forever. All she knew, riding out at first light with her bag of herbs and her rifle across her knees, was that somewhere out there, a man was dying of something that might, possibly, with the right hands and the right care, not have to kill him after all. She rode 2 valleys over, into hill country she did not know, following a trail Otis had sketched crudely on the back of a feed receipt. The land changed as she rode, grass giving way to juniper and scrub oak, the ground rising in long red shoulders toward the foothills. By mid-afternoon, she saw smoke rising thin and gray from a scatter of lodges tucked into a fold of the hills, and her stomach tightened with a nervousness she had not felt in years. She had heard the stories, the way everyone in Coldwater Flat had heard the stories, of raids and burned homesteads, of a war that had never quite ended, only gone quiet and watchful. She did not know if she would be welcome. She did not know if she would be shot before she said a word. But she thought of her mother's hands, and she rode on. A young man met her at the edge of the camp, rifle half raised, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sheer size of her. A full head taller than him, even on horseback, shoulders that filled out her coat like a man's. She had seen that look 1,000 times. She held her hands up, empty, slow. "I heard your chief is dying," she said, plain, no preamble, because she had learned that plain words traveled better across suspicion than soft ones.
"I know wounds. I'd like to see him."
The young man did not lower his rifle. He called out something over his shoulder in a language she did not know, and a moment later an older woman emerged from one of the lodges, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wrapped in a blanket the color of dried blood. She looked at Odalys for a long moment, looked at her the way people always looked at her, up and down, cataloging the size of her. But something in the older woman's face was different from the looks Odalys was used to. Not fear, not mockery. Calculation. "You are large," the woman said finally, in careful, accented English.
"I am,"
Odalys said. She did not apologize for it. She never apologized for it, though the words always cost her something to hold steady. The older woman's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close to one. "Good. He will need someone strong to hold him still while the wound is cleaned. Come." And just like that, without ceremony, without more words than were needed, Odalys was led into the camp, past watchful eyes and murmured words she could not translate, toward a lodge at the center where a man lay dying. She ducked through the entrance. She ducked through every entrance, always had. And the smell hit her first. Rot, sweet and terrible. The smell her mother had taught her to fear more than blood itself. In the dim light, an old man lay on a pallet of furs, his chest rising and falling in shallow, labored breaths, his face gray, his eyes closed. She knelt beside him, knelt because even kneeling she was tall enough to loom, and gently pulled back the dressing on his side. What she saw made her jaw tighten. A wound, old, that had never healed clean. Infection deep in the muscle, angry red streaking out from a center gone black and weeping. This was not a wound 2 years old that had simply failed to close. This was a wound that had been closed wrong, stitched, hasty, and shallow over something still broken beneath, so that it had festered slow and quiet ever since, a rot working inward like ivy through stone.
"Who treated this?"
she asked, not looking up. The silver-haired woman, Ituha, she would later learn her name was, the chief's sister, said nothing for a moment. Then, "A man came, after, said he was sorry, said he wanted to make it right. He brought a doctor once from the fort. The doctor looked, said there was nothing more to do, and left." Odalys's hands had gone still over the wound.
"What man?"
Ituha's eyes met hers, dark and old and careful.
"A rancher, from the Eastern Valley. He comes sometimes to see if my brother has died yet."
Something cold moved through Odalys's chest, some instinct she did not yet have words for. But there would be time for questions later. Right now there was only the wound, and the man dying beneath her hands, and the long, patient work of trying to undo 2 years of rot, with clean cloth and yarrow, and whatever strength her big, capable hands could offer. She worked through the night. She lanced what needed lancing, packed what needed packing, held the old chief still through the worst of it while he groaned and thrashed weakly against pain that had lived in him so long it had become almost a second heartbeat. Ituha held the lamp close and watched with sharp, unreadable eyes, occasionally murmuring instructions in her own language to the young man who had first met Odalys at the camp's edge. His name was Tokala, she learned, the chief's grandson. By dawn, the old chief's breathing had eased. Not healed, she was honest with herself about that. Honest in the way her mother had taught her to be honest about wounds, because false hope killed as surely as infection did. But eased. A fighting chance, where before there had been none. She sat back on her heels, exhausted, her hands stained dark,
and found Ituha watching her with an expression that had shifted somewhere in the night from calculation into something warmer. "You will stay," Ituha said. It was not quite a question. "I have cattle," Odalys said. "I have to go back, but I'll return, tomorrow, every day until he's past the worst of it." Ituha nodded slowly. 2 days, she said. "Come back in 2 days, and we will know if he lives." Odalys rode home in the pale light of early morning, her body aching, her mind turning over the words the old woman had said. "A rancher from the Eastern Valley, who comes sometimes to see if my brother has died yet." And she did not yet understand what those words meant, did not yet understand that she had just stepped, without knowing it, into the middle of a scheme 2 years in the making. She did not yet know that word of a giant white woman riding alone into an Apache camp to save a dying chief would travel faster than she could ride home, carried on the tongues of settlers and traders alike, twisted and reshaped with every telling until it reached ears that had been waiting for 2 years for the old chief to simply die and take his secret with him. She did not yet know that 2 days later, 60 warriors would ride to her ranch, and that what she would fear as vengeance would turn out to be something else entirely. 40 miles east, in a valley greener and gentler than the hard country around Coldwater Flat, a man named Silas Vantry sat behind a mahogany desk in a ranch house too fine for the frontier, sipping coffee from a china cup, reading a letter that had just arrived by Ryder. Vantry was not a large man, not a loud man, not the kind of man who announced himself in a room. He was smooth voice, smooth hands that had not done real work in a decade, smooth manner that made men trust him before they had any reason to. He owned the largest spread in 3 counties, held paper on half the smaller ranches in the region, and had built his fortune quietly, methodically, the way a spider builds a web, one thread of debt and doubt at a time, until the whole structure held its victims fast without their ever quite noticing they'd been caught. He read the letter twice. His jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, the only sign that anything had disturbed the careful calm he wore like a coat. A white woman, large, riding alone into Chief Sitting Elk's camp, treating his wound, the old man improving. He set the letter down and looked out his window at the green valley spreading below him, at the cattle grazing fat on grass that, if certain old maps and older treaties were ever dug up and read aloud in the right courtroom, did not entirely belong to him. 2 years he had waited. 2 years since the raid he had arranged, dressed up as an act of war between rival bands, blamed on a neighboring tribe he'd paid handsomely to take credit for the burning, the killing, the wound he himself had driven into an old chief's side, rather than let the man live to tell anyone what he had seen the week before the raid. Vantry's own men, surveying land that belonged by treaty to Sitting Elk's people, land with water rights, land that ran along the river that fed every ranch in the valley, including, most critically, land that would soon be worth a fortune once the railroad survey came through, as Vantry had learned it would, 18 months before anyone else in the territory. He had thought the wound would finish the job the fire had not. He had thought 2 years of slow rot would do what a blade to the chest, driven and twisted, had somehow failed to do outright. And now some giant of a woman had ridden in from nowhere and stitched the whole scheme back together with clean cloth and stubbornness. He called for his foreman, a broad, humorless man named Reeve Dashel, who had been with Vantry long enough to know which of his employer's orders were meant to be questioned and which were not. "There's a woman," Vantry said, his voice as even and pleasant as always. "Over near Coldwater Flat. Large woman, runs some cattle alone. She's taken an interest in Chief Sitting Elk's health." Dashiell's eyes narrowed slightly. He understood, without needing more words than that, exactly what kind of interest his employer wanted taken in return. "I don't want her hurt," Vantry added, almost as an afterthought, sipping his coffee. "That would raise questions I'd rather not answer. I want her discouraged. Paperwork, debts, whatever's owed on that little spread of hers, buy it up, if there's any to be found. Make her life difficult enough that riding 2 valleys over to play nurse stops seeming worth the trouble." Dashiell nodded once and left to do as he was told, and Vantry returned to his coffee, and outside his window the green valley rolled on toward the river, patient, indifferent, holding its secrets the way land always does, quietly, and for a long time, until someone finally comes looking hard enough to make it give them up. He did not yet know that the giant woman he intended to discourage with paperwork was not in fact the kind of woman paperwork discouraged. He did not yet know that 60 warriors, once they heard what she had done for their dying chief, would decide on their own account that she was owed a debt no ledger could measure, and that the manner in which they chose to repay it would set in motion the very reckoning he had spent 2 years and 1 dying old man trying to prevent. 2 days after that first long night in the lodge, Odalys rode back to the Apache camp as promised, her saddlebags heavier this time with more cloth, more herbs, a jar of rendered fat mixed with the crushed root Ituha had shown her, one that grew wild along the creek beds and worked, somehow, better than anything in Doc Aldis's black bag back in town. She found the chief awake, not strong, nowhere near strong, but awake, his eyes tracking her as she ducked through the lodge entrance, his cracked lips moving in something that might have been the ghost of a greeting. Ituha met her with something Odalys had not expected, tears standing bright in the old woman's dark eyes, though her face stayed composed, dignified, in the way of someone who had learned long ago that grief and joy both needed to be worn quietly in front of others. "He asked for broth this morning," Ituha said. "He has not asked for anything in weeks." Odalys felt something loosen in her own chest, something she had not realized was clenched so tight. She knelt again beside the old chief and checked the wound. Still angry, still healing slow, but the black at its edges had receded, the red less furious, the smell of rot fading beneath the sharper, cleaner smell of the herb paste doing its work. "He's fighting," she said, half to herself. "He is stubborn," Ituha said, and there was warmth in it now, an old family joke worn smooth with use. "Like someone else I have met recently." Odalys huffed something close to a laugh, a rare sound from her, rusty with disuse, and Ituha's mouth curved in something that was, finally, unmistakably a smile. The old chief's name, she learned that day, was Sitting Elk, and he had led his people for 30 years through drought and war and the slow, grinding pressure of a world that kept moving its boundaries inward around them. Tokala, his grandson, sat with them as Odalys worked, watching her hands with the same careful attention he'd watched her with that first day, though the suspicion in his eyes had softened into something more like respect. "You are not like other whites who come," he said at one point, testing the words carefully, as if unsure whether they would offend her. "No," Odalys agreed simply. "I don't suppose I am." She did not explain further, and he did not ask her to. There was an understanding passing between them that needed no elaboration. 2 people who had each, in their own ways, spent a lifetime being looked at rather than seen, recognizing in each other something like kinship. She returned the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, until the visits became a rhythm as steady as her wood splitting at dawn, and the camp stopped watching her with wary eyes and started watching for her instead. Children running out to meet her horse on the trail, an old woman named Chepa, who wove baskets, pressing a small woven token into her hand one afternoon without a word of explanation, just a fierce, direct look that said more than words could have. Sitting out grew stronger by slow degrees. He sat up. He ate solid food. He asked one evening, in halting English that surprised her, he had learned some, trading with soldiers decades before, for her name. "Odalys," she told him. "Odalys Marsh." He said it back to her slowly, testing the shape of it. And then he said something in his own language to Ituha, who translated with a small, private smile. "He says it is a name that sounds like it was made to be remembered. He says he will remember it, and so will his people, for as long as any of them draw breath." Odalys had to look away for a moment, out through the lodge entrance at the hills going gold in the late light, because something in her throat had gone tight, and she was not a woman accustomed to being thanked, not accustomed to being wanted rather than merely tolerated, and the feeling of it was almost too large to hold, larger even than she was. She did not yet know, riding home that evening with the sunset burning orange behind the ridgeline, that Ituha's careful questioning that day about her ranch, about how long she had lived alone, about whether men from the Eastern Valley had ever come around asking about her land, had not been idle curiosity. She did not yet know that word of a rancher's foreman making inquiries about a lone woman's debts had already reached the camp through trading contacts who moved between worlds, or that the old woman had gone very still and quiet upon hearing it, her sharp eyes narrowing in a way that boded ill for whoever had sent the foreman asking. She did not yet know that 60 warriors were already quietly beginning to talk among themselves about a debt owed, and what manner of thing might be done to repay it properly, in the old way, the way debts of life had always been repaid among their people since long before any white rancher's ledger had ever tried to put a price on land or blood or gratitude. She rode home to Coldwater Flat with her chest full of something unfamiliar and warm, unaware that far behind her, in a lodge lit gold by a dying fire, an old chief who had been 2 days from death 2 weeks before was already speaking quietly to his grandson about riders and numbers and timing. The trouble at Odalys's ranch started small, the way trouble born of paperwork always does, not with a shout, but with a knock. It was a bank clerk from the Territorial Land Office, a nervous young man named Perrin Coates, who could not quite meet her eyes when he handed her the notice, who explained in a stammering rush that there had been an irregularity discovered in her original land filing, some question about a survey marker that had shifted, some clerical matter regarding back taxes on a parcel she had paid clean every year since she'd claimed it. "I don't understand," Odalys said, reading the paper twice, her jaw tightening as the words swam, and refused to make the kind of sense that honest words usually made. "I've paid every year. I have the receipts." "I'm sure there's some mistake," Coates said, though something in the way he said it suggested he did not believe that at all, suggested he had been sent to deliver bad news dressed up as bureaucratic confusion, and did not much like the errand. "The office in the territorial seat wants the matter cleared up. 60 days, or the claim reverts." 60 days. 60 days to prove, through some tangle of paperwork she had never needed before, that land she had broken with her own 2 hands, land she had bled into and buried 3 years of labor beneath, was actually hers.
She stood on her own porch long after Coates had ridden off, the notice trembling slightly in her big hands. Not from fear, she told herself, though some part of her recognized the lie even as she thought it, and looked out over the 40 head of cattle grazing in the long spring grass, at the garden coming up green along the fence line, at the cabin she had built board by board with blistered palms and a stubbornness nobody had asked her to have. She thought of Otis Kellerman's words from months before, half forgotten until now. A rancher from the Eastern Valley who comes sometimes to see if my brother has died yet. Something cold moved through her. A coincidence, perhaps. Land offices made mistakes, she knew that. But the timing sat wrong in her stomach, the way a bad meal sits wrong. And she found herself thinking not of the paperwork, but of the wound she had spent 2 weeks nursing back from the edge of death, and of an old woman's careful, pointed questions about whether men had come around asking about her debts. She rode into Coldwater Flat the next morning to see Otis, who confirmed in his roundabout gossiping way what she had already begun to suspect. "Vantry," Otis said, lowering his voice though the mercantile was empty save for the two of them. "Silas Vantry, big spread east of here. He's been buying up paper on half the small outfits in 3 counties these past 2 years. Quiet about it, mostly. Man smooth as river stone. Never raises his voice, never gets his own hands dirty. But there's a pattern, if you look for it. Ranchers who cross him, or who sit on land he wants, tend to find themselves tangled up in surveys and back taxes and all manner of paperwork trouble, right up until they sell out cheap just to be shut of the headache." "And he's interested in my land?" Odalys asked, though even as she said it, she understood the question was not quite right. Her 40 acres, dry and modest, held nothing a man like Vantry would want for its own sake. Otis's mustache twitched thoughtfully. "Maybe not your land exactly, but you've been riding out to that Apache camp regular, near 2 months now, haven't you? Whole town's talking about it, some admiring, some not so much." His eyes cut to her, apologetic. "Vantry's spread borders that same territory on the east side. There's been talk for years about a survey error, about whether the treaty line actually runs where everyone's always assumed it runs, or whether it runs further east, onto land Vantry's been grazing free for a decade." Odalys stood very still, turning this new information over the way she'd turn a strange stone found in a field, testing its weight, its shape, looking for the vein of truth running through it. "If that old chief dies," Otis said quietly, "and dies without ever telling anyone what he apparently saw right before that raid 2 years back, well, ground that's disputed stays disputed a lot longer once the one man who could speak to it is in the ground himself." The pieces settled into place in Odalys's mind with the cold, clicking finality of a rifle bolt closing. The raid. The wounds that would not heal, stitched wrong on purpose. The doctor who had come once pronounced the case hopeless and never returned. Vantry's visits to see if the old man had died yet. And now, the moment she had nursed Sitting Elk back from the edge of death, paperwork trouble arriving at her own door like a warning, or a threat, or both. She was not just a woman who had ridden out to do a kindness. She had, without meaning to, without even understanding the shape of what she'd stepped into, become the reason a 2-year-old scheme was still unraveling, instead of quietly finishing itself. "I need a lawyer," she said aloud, mostly to herself. "And I need to know exactly what that old chief saw the week before his people were burned out." Otis's face had gone grave, all trace of gossip's easy pleasure drained out of it. "Odalys," he said, using her name instead of the careful sideways references he usually managed. "If what you're saying is true, if Vantry's behind that raid, behind that man's wound, that's not paperwork trouble anymore.
That's murder trouble. And men who arrange one killing to protect a secret generally aren't shy about arranging a second. She held his gaze steady, though something cold and clear-eyed had settled behind her eyes, the look of a woman doing arithmetic on a threat and finding the sum entirely unacceptable. "Then I suppose," she said, "we'd best find out what he saw before Vantry decides it's safer if none of us are around to hear it." She rode home that evening beneath a sky gone the color of a fresh bruise, purple and yellow-green at the edges. And she did not yet know that, at that very hour, 60 miles behind her, Sitting Elk, stronger now, sitting up, eating solid food, speaking in longer and longer stretches each day, had finally told Ituha and Tokala the full account of what he had seen the week before the fire. White men on his people's land, driving stakes into the ground along the river, laughing about water rights and railroad money in a way that made it clear they believed no one would ever be alive to contest it. She did not yet know that the moment that story left the old chief's lips, it began traveling through the camp like a spark through dry grass, and that 60 warriors, young men who had grown up hearing the story of the raid told in half-truths and grief-silenced fragments, were now, for the first time, hearing the whole of it. She did not yet know that they had also heard, in the same breath, the story of a giant woman who had ridden in alone to save their dying chief's life, and that in the tradition of a people who understood debts of blood and life far older and far more binding than any land office's paperwork, a decision was already forming among them about what must be done and who must be protected, before Vantry's men could finish what the raid 2 years before had failed to complete. She did not yet know that in 2 days' time 60 riders would appear on the ridge above her ranch, and that her first thought, seeing them, would be that her death had finally come to collect what her kindness had apparently cost her. The 2 days between the land office notice and the riders on the ridge passed for Odalys in a strange, suspended quiet, the kind of stillness that settles over a house before a storm, when the animals go silent and the light turns a strange, flat color, and every sound seems to carry further than it should. She did not sleep well. She kept her rifle within reach, propped by the door instead of racked on the wall, and she found herself glancing toward the tree line more often than usual while she worked, though she told herself it was only the paperwork trouble weighing on her, only Otis's grim warning about men who arranged one killing being unafraid to arrange a second. On the first evening, a rider came, not Vantry's foreman, not anyone she recognized, but a boy of perhaps 16 from a neighboring spread, sent with a message scrawled in a hand she did not know. Land office clerk says the survey question's been escalated to the territorial marshal's office. Says it's out of local hands now. Thought you should know. She read it twice, standing in her doorway with the evening light fading gold behind her, and could not tell if it was good news or worse news. A marshal meant law, meant something beyond Vantry's quiet reach, perhaps, or it meant the scheme had grown large enough, urgent enough, that Vantry was willing to risk drawing federal attention to make sure it finished the way he wanted. She thought of Sitting Elk, 2 valleys over, growing stronger every day, closer every day to being well enough to speak plainly about what he'd seen. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes to people who have spent their lives reading danger in a room before anyone announces it, that time was no longer a gift. It was a countdown, and she did not know which end would run out first, the old chief's strength or Vantry's patience. She almost rode back to the camp that second night, wanted badly to see with her own eyes that Sitting Elk was still breathing, still improving, still safe. But something held her back, some instinct that said her own ranch, her own porch, her own rifle propped by the door might be needed closer to home before this was over. She was right. It was mid-morning on the second day, the sun climbing white and hard over the eastern ridge, when she heard it. Not gunfire, not shouting, but something stranger. The low, steady rumble of many horses moving together, a sound that built slowly out of the quiet like distant thunder gathering itself before a storm breaks. She stepped out onto her porch, rifle in hand, her heart climbing into her throat, and looked toward the ridge where the sound was coming from. And there they were. 60 riders, at least. She would count them properly later and find the number held true. 60, exactly. A fact that would strike her afterward as somehow deliberate, ceremonial, though in the moment all she registered was the sheer, overwhelming size of it. A wall of horses and men strung out along the entire length of the ridge above her ranch, silhouetted black against the white morning sun, so that she could not make out faces, only shapes, only the bristling suggestion of rifles and lances catching the light. Her mouth went dry. Her hands, steady on the rifle her whole life, trembled once before she forced them still. This is it, she thought.
This is the reckoning Otis warned about. Except it isn't Vantry's men come to collect on paperwork. It's the very people I tried to help, come instead to finish what that first raid started. Because somehow, in some way she could not yet understand, everything had gone wrong. And her kindness had been read as something else, some trespass, some insult she had not intended and could not now take back. She thought of running. She thought of the rifle in her hands and the 60 rifles she could not see clearly enough to count arrayed against her, and some cold, practical part of her mind began doing the arithmetic of a fight she could not possibly win. But she did not run. She had spent her whole life being looked at, being sized up, being found too much or not enough by rooms full of people who had never once bothered to actually see her. She was not going to spend what might be the last morning of her life running from a fight she did not fully understand. So she stood her ground on her own porch, rifle lowered but not set aside, chin up, shoulders squared in the way that had always made small men flinch and small-minded men sneer. And she watched the line of riders begin, slowly, deliberately, to descend the ridge toward her ranch. And at the front of that line, she began to make out a rider whose shape seemed strange, wrong somehow for the pace and posture of the others. An older man, sitting a horse with the careful, deliberate posture of someone recently and severely wounded, flanked closely by 2 riders who seemed less like guards than like escorts helping to steady him in the saddle. Her breath caught. It couldn't be. He was too weak, surely, too newly risen from a wound that had nearly killed him to be sitting a horse at all, let alone riding at the head of 60 warriors on a 2-hour journey across hard country. But as the riders drew close enough for faces to resolve out of shadow and glare, she saw it was true. Sitting Elk himself, pale still, thinner than he should have been, but upright, his eyes fixed steadily on her across the last 100 yards of open ground between the ridge and her porch, rode at the very front of the column, with Tokala at his right hand and Ituha, unmistakable even at this distance, riding just behind him with her chin high and her silver hair loose beneath a red blanket wrapped close against the morning chill. Odalys stood frozen on her porch, rifle forgotten in her hands, understanding dawning in her chest slow and enormous, and entirely unlike the fear that had gripped her only moments before. She did not yet know what this gathering meant, not for certain, not with the kind of clarity that would let her lower her guard completely, but some old buried part of her, the part that still remembered her mother's hands and her mother's voice, whispered that this was not vengeance riding down off that ridge. This was something else.
something she had no name for yet, because nobody had ever ridden 60 strong to her door for any reason at all, kind or cruel, in the whole of her guarded, solitary life. The column halted at the edge of her yard, 60 horses stamping and blowing in the morning air, 60 riders sitting silent and watchful, and Sitting Elk nudged his horse forward alone, closing the last stretch of ground between them at a slow, careful walk, until he stopped directly before her porch and looked up at her with eyes that 2 months before she had watched flutter closed on the edge of death. "Odalys Marsh," he said, his voice stronger than she had ever heard it, carrying clearly across the silent yard to the 60 riders waiting behind him. "We have not come to take,
We have come to give." The rifle slipped from Odalys's hands and struck the porch boards with a clatter that seemed, in that hushed moment, unbearably loud. And she found she could not speak at all, could only stand there with her heart hammering and her eyes suddenly, unexpectedly, stinging with tears she had not shed in longer than she could remember. She did not yet know what form their gift would take, or how completely it would upend the quiet, guarded life she had built for herself on this dry patch of land. She did not yet know that what happened next, in the hour that followed, as 60 riders dismounted and an old chief explained, in slow and careful English, exactly what debt they had ridden to repay, would change not only her own fate, but would also, within the month, bring the whole rotten architecture of Silas Vantry's 2-year scheme crashing down in a public reckoning that all of Coldwater Flat would still be talking about years later. All she knew, in that first, raw moment, was that the fear draining out of her left behind something she had almost forgotten the shape of. The feeling of being not merely looked at, but seen. Sitting Elk dismounted slowly, with Tokala's steadying hand at his elbow, and stood before her on legs that trembled slightly, but held. "2 winters ago," he said, choosing his English words with the deliberate care of a man laying stones for a bridge he needed to hold real weight. "My people were burned from their home. I was cut and left to die slow, so that whoever did this thing would not carry the blood of it plainly on his hands. I did not understand then who had done this, or why. I understand now." He glanced back once at Ituha, who nodded, her face composed but her eyes bright and hard. "A man came to my land before the fire," Sitting Elk continued. "White men with him, driving stakes along the river, talking of a railroad, talking of water that would be worth more than gold once iron rails came through this country. I watched them from the ridge. I do not think they saw me, but perhaps they did. Perhaps that is why, 1 week later, my people burned, and I was cut, and left to rot slow instead of dying quick, so that if I lived, I would live too broken to speak, and if I died, I would take what I had seen into the ground with me." Odalys felt something clench hard in her chest. Not surprise, exactly, since Otis's warnings and her own cold arithmetic had already led her most of the way to this same conclusion. But the confirmation of it, spoken plainly by the man who had lived it, landed with a different, heavier weight than mere suspicion ever could. "Vantry," she said quietly. Sitting Elk's eyes sharpened. "You know this name." "I've heard it," Odalys said. "I have paperwork trouble of my own since I started riding out to see you. A land office notice, survey questions, back taxes, nothing that was ever a problem before. A man in town believes it's Vantry's doing, that he's been buying trouble for anyone who gets too close to whatever's true about that land." A murmur ran through the riders still mounted behind Sitting Elk, low and grave, and Odalys understood, watching their faces, that this confirmation, her own small trouble, arriving in the same window of time as their chief's recovery, had struck them as more than coincidence, too. Sitting Elk was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same unhurried, careful attention he'd given his own wound when she first uncovered it for him to see. The attention of a man used to reading the true shape of things beneath whatever surface was presented to him. "You gave me back my life," he said finally, "when you owed me nothing, and when your own people would have called it foolish, or worse, to spend your strength on a dying man in another people's camp. My sister tells me you did not ask for payment."
"Did not ask for anything at all."
"I didn't do it for payment," Odalys said, and her voice, usually so carefully flat and controlled, cracked slightly on the words. "I know," Sitting Elk said. "That is why we have come. Not to repay a debt as one repays a loan, coin for coin. That would insult what you did. We have come instead to stand where you are standing, so that whoever is trying to make your life hard enough that you regret ever riding out to help a dying stranger will understand that you did not act alone, and that you do not stand alone now." He turned then and lifted one arm toward the 60 riders behind him and said something in his own language, strong and carrying, and as one, the riders dismounted. 60 men and women stepping down from their horses in a single, unhurried motion. And Odalys realized, watching them, that they had not come armed for war after all. Many carried tools instead of rifles, coils of rope, axes, baskets of seed and dried meat and woven blankets. "We will help you build," Sitting Elk said, turning back to her. "Whatever needs building, to make this land yours in a way no piece of paper can dispute. Fence line, stronger walls, witnesses, if witnesses are needed, who can speak to what we know of Vantree's dealings, and who can speak to your character before any court that dares to question it. We are 60. We will not all fit inside a courtroom, but we will all stand outside it, if that is what is needed, until the truth is heard." Odalys stood on her porch, tears now openly wet on her face, unashamed of them for perhaps the first time in her adult life, and looked out over 60 people who had ridden 2 hours across hard country, not to take vengeance, and not merely to say thank you, but to plant themselves bodily between her and whatever trouble was coming. The way, she understood now, a family plants itself between one of its own and harm. "I don't know how to thank you for this," she said, her voice rough. Ituha, dismounting last, came to stand beside her brother and reached up. She had to reach up considerably, being nearly a foot shorter than Odalys, even standing on the ground below the porch steps, and took Odalys's large, work-scarred hand in both of her own smaller ones. "You did not thank us when you rode 2 hours into a camp of strangers with nothing but cloth and herbs and a willingness to be useful," Ituha said. "So we will not wait for thanks either. This is simply what is owed, between people who understand what it costs to be seen as too much or not enough, by a world too small to hold either of us properly." The words landed in Odalys's chest like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward that she would feel for days afterward, weeks, longer, because Ituha had named, in a single unadorned sentence, the exact shape of the loneliness Odalys had carried her whole life without ever quite finding words for it herself. That afternoon, 60 people set to work on her ranch with the easy, practiced efficiency of a community accustomed to building things together. Fence posts driven deep and true, a second well dug closer to the cabin, a storage shed reinforced against weather and theft alike. And through it all, laughter, real laughter,
rising up from the yard in a way Odalys's quiet, solitary ranch had never once heard in the 4 years she'd worked it alone. She found herself, by late afternoon, sharing a meal spread across blankets in her own yard with people who, 2 months before, she had never met, passing dried meat and fry bread and the last of her own garden's spring greens hand to hand, in a circle that included her without hesitation, without the careful cataloging looks she had spent her whole life bracing against. A child, one of the camp's youngest, a fearless girl of perhaps 6 who had ridden the whole way tucked in front of her mother's saddle, walked straight up to Odalys, where she sat, and simply climbed into her lap without asking, the way children do when they have not yet been taught to be afraid of things larger than themselves, and looked up at her with open, curious eyes. "You're the biggest person I ever saw," the girl announced. Matter of fact, no cruelty in it at all, only wonder. Odalys laughed, really laughed, a full, surprised sound that startled even her, and said, "I suppose I am." "Good," the girl said, settling more comfortably against her, already losing interest in the conversation in the way of small children, and reaching instead for a piece of fry bread. "Big is good. Big means you can hold more." Odalys did not trust her voice to answer that. She only wrapped one arm gently around the girl and looked out over her own yard, full for the first time with warmth and noise, and people who had chosen, freely and without obligation, to stand beside her, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight for as long as she could remember begin slowly to loosen. She did not yet know that this single afternoon, 60 riders on her ridge, a shared meal in her yard, a child settling trustingly into her lap, would become, within the month, the very thing that shattered Silas Vantry's careful scheme wide open, because word of it would travel through Coldwater Flat exactly as fast and as far as the original rumors of a giant woman riding alone into a war camp had traveled. Except this time, the story arriving in town would carry a very different weight. Not fear, but wonder. And beneath the wonder, in the sharper minds of the townsfolk, the first uncomfortable questions about exactly why a chief who was supposed to have died of an unhealable wound was now, evidently, well enough to ride 2 hours and lead 60 of his people in an afternoon of fence building. By evening, as the 60 riders prepared to make the journey back to their own camp before full dark, Sitting Elk drew Odalys aside one final time, his voice dropping low, meant only for her. "There is something more," he said. "Something I have not yet told even my own council, because I wished to be certain of my strength before I spoke it where it could be acted upon. The men I saw driving stakes along the river before the fire, I marked the place. I could lead a surveyor there, or a marshal, and show exactly where the treaty line runs, and exactly how far past it Vantry's cattle have been grazing free these 10 years since. I have kept this knowledge close, because a secret known only to a dying man is safe from those who would silence him. But I do not intend to die any more, Odalys Marsh. Not for a long while yet. Which means the secret is no longer safe simply by being mine alone. It needs to become something larger than one old man's memory. It needs to become proof." Odalys felt the weight of what he was offering settle onto her shoulders, not unwillingly, but with the sober recognition of someone accepting a task she understood to be dangerous, difficult, and entirely necessary. "Then we'll make it proof," she said. "Together." Sitting Elk studied her for a long moment, something like approval settling into the deep lines of his face. And then he nodded once, sharply, the gesture of a leader confirming an alliance rather than merely accepting a kindness. "Together," he agreed.
As the 60 riders mounted and turned back toward the ridge, the sun sinking gold and orange behind them, painting the whole line of horses and riders in a light that made the moment feel, to Odalys, standing alone once more on her porch, like something out of a story, too large and too strange to have actually happened to a woman as ordinary, or as extraordinary, depending on who was doing the looking, as herself. She did not yet know that within days, the quiet strength of that afternoon would collide head-on with Silas Vantree's mounting desperation, as the land office notice against her ranch suddenly accelerated its timeline, as strange men began appearing on the roads near both her property and the edges of Sitting Elk's territory, and as the fragile, hopeful new alliance she had stumbled into would be tested by exactly the kind of danger Otis Kellerman had warned her about. The danger of men who, having arranged one killing to protect a secret, find themselves entirely willing to arrange a second, and perhaps a third, once the first begins visibly failing to hold. The weeks that followed settled into something Odalys had never known before, a rhythm shared rather than solitary. She rode to the Apache camp 3, sometimes 4 times a week now, no longer solely to tend a wound that had, by early summer, closed clean and strong enough that Sitting Elk walked without assistance, and had begun, cautiously, to resume some of his duties leading his people. Instead, she rode to sit in council with Ituha and Tokala, and a rotating handful of elders, poring over old maps, old memories of the land before the treaty lines had been drawn, cross-referencing what Sitting Elk remembered of the stakes and surveyor's markers he'd watched Vantree's men drive along the river 2 years before. It was slow, careful work, the kind that could not be rushed without risking error, and Odalys found in it an echo of the same patient rhythm she'd always brought to splitting wood at dawn. Swing, crack, swing, crack. Except now the rhythm was question, answer, question, answer. Each piece of information setting the next one into truer alignment. "You have a lawyer's mind," Tokala told her one afternoon, only half teasing, as she carefully cross-referenced a survey date against the season Sitting Elk remembered seeing the stakes driven. "I have a rancher's mind," Odalys corrected, not looking up from the papers. "Which means I've spent a good deal of my life reading contracts written by men who assumed I couldn't." Tokala laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him, and something in the exchange settled comfortably between them. The first real joke either of them had risked with the other, small and dry and entirely unremarkable, except for how much trust it required to offer it at all. Ituha, meanwhile, had taken to teaching Odalys the proper preparation of the root paste that had done more to save her brother's life than anything in Doc Aldis's black bag. And Odalys found herself, on quiet evenings after council business was done, sitting beside the older woman grinding roots in companionable silence, occasionally trading small pieces of their separate histories. Ituha's husband, dead 12 years now of a winter fever. Odalys's mother, dead when Odalys was 17, of a fever much like it, leaving her a set of hands full of half-finished medical knowledge and a homestead claim that had seemed, at the time, like the only inheritance likely to ever come her way. "You never married," Ituha said one evening, not quite a question, turning a root over in her weathered hands. "Men in Coldwater Flat mostly looked at me the way they'd look at a horse too big to be useful," Odalys said, keeping her voice light, though the old ache moved beneath the words the way it always did. "Admired from a distance. Never got close enough to see anything but the size of me." Ituha was quiet for a moment, and then she said simply, "Their loss was considerable, and they were too small themselves to understand it." Odalys said nothing to that, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't have cracked her voice clean in half. but she reached over and set her hand briefly over Ituha's, and the older woman let it rest there, and the two of them sat together in the deepening dusk, grinding roots, saying nothing further. And it was, Odalys thought later, one of the fullest silences she had ever shared with another person. But even as the friendship deepened, even as fragile domesticity took root between her lonely ranch and the camp 2 valleys over, small firsts accumulating like stones building a wall, meals shared, jokes risked, grief traded carefully hand to hand, the shadow of Vantry's scheme kept rising at the edges of every quiet evening, refusing to be ignored for long. The land office notice against her ranch, which should have given her 60 days, was suddenly amended. A rider arrived with new paperwork claiming an expedited review had moved her deadline up to 3 weeks. Otis, when she showed him the notice in the mercantile, went pale beneath his mustache. "That's not how these things move," he said. "Not on their own. Someone's leaning on the land office. Someone with enough weight to make bureaucracy hurry." At the same time, word reached the Apache camp through trading contacts that strange men, hired hands, not local, faces nobody recognized, had been seen riding the boundary lines near Sitting Elk's territory and near Vantry's own eastern spread, moving surveyors' stakes in the dead of night, resetting boundary markers a little further west each time, inch by inch, in a slow, deliberate campaign to erase, physically, on the ground itself, the very evidence Sitting Elk had promised to help prove. "He's trying to move the line before anyone official comes to measure it," Odalys said grimly when Tokala brought her the news. "If the markers are gone by the time a surveyor's called out, there's nothing left to measure against but old memory. And old memory's easy for a judge to dismiss, especially if the man dismissing it already owes Vantry money, or favors, or both." Sitting Elk, present for this council, was quiet for a long moment, his face set in the particular stillness Odalys had learned meant he was weighing something heavy. "Then we do not wait for a surveyor," he said finally. "We mark the old lines ourselves, tonight, in a way that cannot be quietly moved by a man with a shovel and no witnesses. Stone. Cairns, built high enough and heavy enough that moving them again would require a wagon and a crew, not one man working alone in the dark. And we do it with enough people present that no one can later claim the markers were placed dishonestly, after the fact, to suit our own story." The council fell into motion with the same brisk, practiced efficiency Odalys had first witnessed on her own ranch weeks before. Plans made, tasks divided, riders sent to gather stone-hauling parties from among the camp's strongest young men and women. Odalys rode home that night beneath a sky thick with stars, her chest tight with a mixture of hope and dread she was becoming uncomfortably familiar with, understanding that whatever quiet, fragile peace she had found in these past weeks of shared meals and root-grinding silences was about to be tested by something far larger and far more dangerous than paperwork alone. She did not yet know that Silas Vantry, informed by Dashel of the accelerated land office timeline's failure to produce the desired result, Odalys had not panicked, had not sold out cheap, had instead apparently gathered allies rather than folding under pressure, had begun to consider measures considerably less patient than paperwork. She did not yet know that within a week, the careful, deliberate line moving in the dark would escalate into something far more direct, when Vantry's hired men, growing bolder and more careless as their employers' patience thinned, would be caught in the act of setting fire to a section of dry grass along the disputed boundary. Not a raid this time, not a massacre, but a warning, meant to remind everyone involved exactly how quickly fire could still be made to speak on Vantry's behalf, should quieter methods continue to fail. She did not yet know that the fire, when it came, would be seen by more witnesses than Vantry's men accounted for, and that among those witnesses would be a name that would prove, in the end, to be the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire case against him. The fire came 8 days later, in the dry hush of a July night, when the grass along the river bend stood tall and gold and had not seen rain in nearly 3 weeks. Odalys was at the camp that evening, later than usual, helping Ituha catalog the last of the cairn building supplies for the following morning's work, when a young rider came pounding in from the western edge of the territory, his horse lathered, his voice cracking with urgency as he reported flames along the boundary line, right where the new stone cairns had been set only 2 days before. The camp erupted into motion. Sitting Elk, moving faster than his still healing body should perhaps have allowed, was mounted and riding within minutes, Tokala at his side, a dozen riders falling in behind them, and Odalys, without a moment's hesitation, swung up onto her own horse and rode with them, her heart hammering, her mind racing through every terrible possibility the word fire could summon in a place that had already once burned. They crested the last rise above the river bend to find the grass fully alight, flames leaping 4 and 5 feet high in places, driven by a hot, dry wind that carried sparks dangerously close to a stand of cottonwoods that, if caught, would send the fire roaring straight toward the nearest lodges. But it was not only fire that greeted them. Silhouetted against the flames, 3 riders were making their hurried retreat eastward, too far already to catch, moving with the unmistakable haste of men who knew exactly what they'd done and precisely why they needed to be somewhere else when anyone arrives to ask questions. "Vantry's men," Tokala spat, recognizing something in their horses, their gear, even at this distance. Details Odalys couldn't make out herself, but trusted absolutely, given everything else they'd learned in recent weeks. There was no time to give chase. The fire demanded every hand, every bucket, every wet blanket that could be found. And for the next 2 hours, the camp fought the flames with the same grim, unified efficiency they'd brought to fence building and cairn raising, beating back the fire line by line, wetting down the cottonwoods, digging fire breaks with shovels and bare, blistering hands. Odalys's massive strength put to use, hauling water in quantities that would have taken 2 ordinary men to match, swing after swing, bucket after bucket, until her shoulders burned and her lungs ached with smoke. By the time the last of the flames guttered out against the damp fire break, the eastern sky was beginning to pale toward dawn, and the exhausted, soot-streaked camp gathered along the blackened boundary line to survey what had been lost. A stretch of grazing land, some months of new growth, but critically, miraculously, not the lodges, not the cottonwoods, not a single life. And not, Odalys realized with grim satisfaction as she walked the line with Sitting Elk and Tokala in the gray dawn light, the cairns themselves, too heavy, too solid to be damaged by grass fire, standing scorched but unmoved exactly where they'd been placed, stubborn gray sentinels amid the blackened ground.
"They tried to erase the evidence and only proved it further,"
Sitting Elk said, surveying the scene with something like grim satisfaction of his own. "Fire cannot move stone. He has shown us, in trying to frighten us into leaving, exactly how afraid he actually is." But the fire had brought something else with it, something none of them expected until a weathered old trapper named Silas Croft, no relation to Vantry despite the coincidence of the first name, a fact he made a point of clarifying with visible distaste, rode into camp mid-morning, having heard news of the fire from a neighboring trading post, and asked to speak with whoever was in charge. Croft had been checking his trap lines along the river the previous evening, he explained, well before the fire started, and had seen 3 riders, men he recognized, having done occasional work for Vantry's outfit himself some years back before a dispute over wages soured him permanently on the man. moving along the boundary with what he'd taken at the time for ordinary night riding, but which he now understood, given the fire that followed within the hour, to have been something considerably more deliberate. "I don't much care for Vantry," Croft admitted, spitting to one side for emphasis. "Man shorted me on wages 6 years back and smiled the whole while doing it. I'll swear to what I saw, in front of whoever needs hearing it. Judge, marshal, don't much matter to me." Odalys felt something click into place in her chest. Not triumph, not yet. The situation remained too precarious for triumph, but something adjacent to it. The first solid foothold in what had, until this moment, been mostly circumstance and old memory and careful inference. An independent witness. A white trapper with no loyalty to either side, no reason to lie, and a personal grudge that made his testimony, if anything, more credible rather than less, since he had nothing to gain from Vantry's downfall except the simple satisfaction of watching a man who'd cheated him finally answer for something. "We'll need it written down," Odalys said. "Signed, if you're willing, and witnessed by someone the territorial court will trust. A magistrate, if we can get one out here, or, failing that, sworn before whatever local official still has enough backbone left to stand up to a man like Vantry." Croft nodded slowly. "Reckon I owe the old chief that much, and more besides, for the years his people put up with rustlers taking pot shots at their stock without much recourse, while men like Vantry got treated soft by every land office and lawman in 3 counties. He paused, working his jaw thoughtfully. "Man's due a reckoning. Past due, if you ask me." Sitting Elk extended his hand, a gesture Odalys had learned, in her weeks among the camp, was not lightly offered, and Croft took it with the solemn understanding of a man who recognized he was being trusted with something that mattered. As the exhausted camp began the slow work of cleaning up after the fire, tending burns, salvaging what could be salvaged from the scorched grazing land, Odalys found a quiet moment to sit beside Sitting Elk on a fallen log at the edge of the blackened field, both of them too tired for much conversation, content simply to sit together in the fragile relief of a disaster survived rather than repeated. "2 years ago," Sitting Elk said finally, his voice low, "fire took everything, and I lay in the dirt believing I would die there, and that whatever I had seen would die with me, unspoken, and Vantry would simply go on unchallenged forever. Tonight, fire came again, meant to finish what it started before, and instead—" He gestured slowly at the exhausted, soot-streaked camp working steadily around them, at the unmoved cairns standing gray against the black ground, at Odalys herself sitting beside him. Instead, it only proved how much has changed since that night. Odalys said nothing for a long moment, watching the sun climb fully over the ridge, gilding the blackened field in a strange, stark beauty, the green world beyond it entirely unharmed, waiting. "It's not finished," she said finally. "He's desperate now. Desperate men do worse things than send 3 riders with torches." Sitting Elk nodded slowly, his face grave. "Then we finish it first," he said, "before he finds the nerve to try something he can't walk back from." She did not yet know that within the week, Croft's signed statement, combined with Sitting Elk's detailed account and the physical evidence of the stone cairns marking the true boundary line, would find its way, carried by a rider Odalys trusted completely, to the territorial marshal's office, where it would land on the desk of a weathered, unimpressed lawman named Marshal Ezra Whitlock, a man with a well-earned reputation for disliking smooth-talking ranchers, considerably more than he disliked the inconvenience of riding out to remote territory to investigate their affairs. She did not yet know that Whitlock, upon reading the statement, would recall,
with the long, patient memory of a man who'd worked territorial law for 2 decades. A handful of other quiet complaints filed against Vantry over the years, always withdrawn before they reached a courtroom, always accompanied by some sudden and unexplained change of fortune for the complainants that looked, in hindsight, considerably less like coincidence and more like payoff or intimidation. And she did not yet know that Vantry, sensing the net drawing tighter despite his every effort to keep it loose, was about to make the single greatest miscalculation of his carefully calculated life, one that would bring the whole rotten structure of his 2-year scheme crashing down in the middle of Coldwater Flats' own town square, in front of every witness he had spent 2 years trying to avoid. Marshal Ezra Whitlock arrived in Coldwater Flat on a hot, still morning in early August, riding a rangy gray gelding and wearing the kind of unhurried, watchful expression that told Otis Kellerman, who greeted him first as he greeted most newcomers to town, that this was not a man who would be easily managed by anybody's smooth talk. Word had already gone ahead of him, carried on the same networks of gossip and trade that had once carried rumors of a giant woman riding alone into an Apache camp. The marshal was here about the Vantry business. Nobody in town said this loudly. Vantry's money and influence reached into enough pockets, enough favors owed and mortgages held, that plenty of Coldwater Flats citizens had learned to keep their opinions of the man carefully unspoken, whatever they privately believed. But not everybody stayed silent.
Whitlock, working methodically over the following days, found more willing tongues than Vantry had likely accounted for. A bank teller who remembered, uneasily, processing an unusually large and unusually private transfer to the Territorial Land Office around the same time Odalys's survey trouble first surfaced. A stable hand who'd overheard Dashel giving orders to riders he didn't recognize, orders that included the word boundary and the word quiet in the same uneasy sentence. Doc Aldis himself, finally persuaded to speak plainly about the single visit he'd paid to Sitting Elk 2 years before, and the pressure he'd felt, never spoken outright, but unmistakably present, to declare the old chief's wound hopeless and leave it at that. "I didn't like it," Doc Aldis admitted to Whitlock, sitting in his own small office with the marshal's steady, patient gaze fixed on him. "Wound was bad, sure, but I've seen worse men pull through with the right care. I told Vantry that when he asked me out there and paid my fee himself, which struck me as strange even then. A rancher 40 miles distant paying a doctor's bill for an Apache chief he had no evident connection to. He told me the tribe couldn't afford ongoing treatment anyway, so what was the use in raising false hope? I told myself that made sense at the time." His face had gone tight with old, unexamined shame. "Didn't sit right even then. Sits a good deal worse now, knowing what I know." Whitlock had listened to each of these accounts with the same unhurried patience, writing careful notes in a battered leather notebook. And by the end of his first week in Coldwater Flat, he had assembled a case that, while not yet complete, had grown considerably heavier than the sum of any single witness's testimony alone. He rode out to meet Odalys personally on the 6th day, finding her in her garden, and studied her for a long moment with the same careful, assessing look she'd grown so weary of over the years. Except this time, when he finished looking, he simply nodded once, as though whatever he'd been checking against had been confirmed, and got down to business without further preamble. "Chief Sitting Elk speaks well of you," he said. "Says you saved his life expecting nothing for it. Says you've been helping him build a case against a man who tried to make sure he never lived long enough to speak at all." "That's the truth of it," Odalys said. Whitlock nodded slowly. "I've built cases against smooth men before," he said. "They're the worst kind, in my experience. Never raise a hand themselves.
Always got someone else's fingerprints on the trigger, the torch, the ledger. Man like that thinks he's untouchable, right up until the moment the whole pile of small, quiet crimes finally gets too heavy for even his good manners to hold up. He paused, studying the fence line Sitting Elk's people had helped her build weeks before. The sturdy new well, the reinforced shed, visible physical proof of an alliance that Vantry's paperwork tricks had entirely failed to break. "I'm calling a public hearing," Whitlock said. "Town Hall, Coldwater Flat, 2 weeks from now. I want Vantry there, answering questions in front of witnesses, not hiding behind a lawyer's letter or a closed office door. Man like that does his worst work in private. Time to see how he manages in a room full of people watching." Odalys felt something settle in her chest at those words. Not quite relief. The danger remained too real and too close for that. But something like the first solid ground beneath her feet after weeks of uncertain footing. "I'll be there," she said. "And Sitting Elk will be there. And Atua and Tokala, and however many of the council choose to stand with him." "Good," Whitlock said. "A man like Vantry counts on people staying quiet, staying separate, staying scared. Best thing you can do to a man like that
Is show up together and stay standing." He rode off toward Vantry's spread that same afternoon, unannounced, to deliver the summons in person. A decision that would later prove, in the retelling around Coldwater Flats stovetops and supper tables for months afterward, to be one of the more satisfying moments in the whole affair, since Whitlock recounted dryly that Vantry's famous smooth composure had cracked visibly, if only for a moment, upon opening his front door to find a territorial marshal standing on his porch with a summons in hand and absolutely no interest in being offered coffee. But composure, Odalys would learn in the 2 weeks that followed, was not so easily broken in a man who had spent a decade building his fortune on precisely the skill of appearing calm while arranging chaos just out of sight. Vantry did not panic, at least not visibly. He did not flee, did not attempt to bribe the marshal, did not do any of the things a lesser schemer might have done in a moment of cornered desperation. Instead, he began, quietly and methodically, to prepare a defense, hiring the sharpest lawyer available in the territorial seat, drafting a counter-narrative that painted himself as a victim of jealous rivals and opportunistic rumor, and, most dangerously of all, according to word that reached Odalys through Otis's careful listening at the mercantile counter, beginning to make inquiries about exactly which witnesses had spoken to the marshal, at exactly what it might cost, in money or in something considerably less pleasant, to persuade one or two of them to reconsider their statements before the hearing. She did not yet know that Croft, the old trapper whose testimony had proven so pivotal, would receive a visit from 2 of Vantry's men only 3 days before the hearing. Men who did not threaten him outright, being too careful for anything so crude, but who mentioned in passing, almost conversationally, how difficult it could be for a man alone in remote country to survive a hard winter if his cabin happened to burn, or his traps happened to go missing, or his small cache of savings happened to disappear from wherever he kept it hidden. She did not yet know that Croft, old and stubborn and still smarting from 6-year-old shorted wages, would send those 2 men away with nothing more than a long, silent stare, and a hand resting meaningfully on the rifle propped by his door. And that this small private act of defiance, unknown to almost everyone until the hearing itself, would become the thread that finally, irrevocably, unraveled whatever was left of Vantry's careful composure. And she did not yet know that the night before the hearing, she herself would receive a visitor of her own, not threatening, but urgent, arriving at her door in the dark with news that would change the shape of everything Whitlock had spent 2 weeks so carefully assembling.
The knock came just past midnight, soft but insistent, and Odalys was awake and at the door with her rifle in hand before the second knock finished sounding, old habits from weeks of uncertainty rising instantly to the surface. It was Tokala, alone, his horse lathered from hard riding, his young face drawn tight with an urgency that made her stomach drop before he'd even spoken a word. "Ituha sent me," he said, breathing hard. "There's a rider from the Eastern Valley, one of Vantry's own hands, name of Purnell, who's had a falling out with Dashel over pay owed him. He came to our camp an hour ago, said he wanted to speak to Sitting Elk before the hearing. Said he had something Vantry would kill to keep quiet." Odalys pulled her coat on over her nightclothes without hesitation, already moving toward her own horse. "What does he have?" "A letter," Tokala said.
"Written in Vantry's own hand, 2 years back, to a railroad surveyor laying out plans for the river route. Plans that only make sense if the boundary line runs considerably further west than anyone's official map has ever shown it. Purnell says he found it by accident, filing old correspondence, and kept it, not knowing what to do with it, until he heard talk in town of the hearing and put together what it might be worth." They rode together through the dark, hard and fast, back to the camp, where Odalys found Sitting Elk already awake, already dressed, sitting across a low fire from a nervous, sweating man in his middle years, who fidgeted with his hat brim and would not quite meet anyone's eyes directly. Purnell's story, told haltingly and with frequent pauses to gather his nerve, filled in the last piece of the puzzle that had been missing from Whitlock's case. Not just motive, not just the pattern of intimidation and paperwork trickery, but direct, physical, written proof, in Vantry's own unmistakable handwriting, that he had known, 2 years before the fire, precisely where the true boundary line ran, and had begun making arrangements with a railroad surveyor based on the assumption that it would soon, by whatever means necessary, be redrawn in his favor. "He never expected the letter to matter," Purnell said, his voice low and shamed. "Never expected anyone but me to ever see the filing cabinet it sat in. I should have come forward sooner. I told myself it wasn't my business. Told myself a lot of things these 2 years, to keep from having to think too hard about what I might have been helping cover up." Sitting Elk regarded the man for a long, silent moment, and Odalys watched something pass across the old chief's face that was not quite forgiveness, but was not condemnation either. The particular weary grace of a man who had learned, through hard experience, that people often came to the truth slowly, circuitously, dragged there by conscience only after fear had loosened its grip enough to let conscience speak. "You have come now," Sitting Elk said finally. "That is what matters in the end. Not how long the road was, but that you walked it." Purnell's shoulders sagged with something like relief, and he handed over the letter, creased, worn soft from being carried and reconsidered many times over in the weeks since he'd first taken it, into Sitting Elk's careful hands. They rode for Whitlock's camp before dawn, the letter secured carefully inside Sitting Elk's coat, Odalys and Tokala flanking him, Purnell trailing along at a distance, still visibly torn between relief at finally acting and fear of what Vantry might do once he discovered the betrayal. They found the marshal already awake, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise with the patient stillness of a man who had learned long ago that important days rarely announced themselves quietly. He read the letter twice, his weathered face giving away nothing, and then he looked up at the small, exhausted group standing before him. An Apache chief, recently risen from near death, a giant of a woman who'd started this whole unraveling with nothing but clean cloth and stubbornness, a nervous ranch hand finally unburdening 2 years of guilt, and a young man who'd ridden through the night twice now in service of a truth larger than any of them individually. "This," Whitlock said quietly, tapping the letter, is the kind of evidence that doesn't leave much room for a smooth man's smooth talking. He looked directly at Purnell. You'll need to testify to where you found this, and how, in front of the whole town. You understand that? Purnell swallowed hard, but nodded. I understand. I'm done being quiet. Odalys felt the weight of the past weeks, the fear, the fire, the paperwork trouble, the long nights of uncertain waiting begin for the first time to lift, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope, though she made herself hold it carefully, at arm's length, the way she'd learned to hold most good things in her life, unwilling yet to trust it fully until she'd seen it through to the end. She did not yet know that Silas Vantry, informed that same morning by an anxious Dashel that Purnell had gone missing from the ranch overnight, along with a certain filing cabinet key, would understand immediately, and with cold, sinking clarity, exactly what had happened, and exactly how thoroughly his 2 years of careful, patient scheming were about to unravel in front of the one audience he had always been most careful to control, the watching eyes of Coldwater Flat itself. She did not yet know that Vantry, faced with the certain collapse of everything he'd built, would make one final, desperate attempt that morning to salvage what he could, not through paperwork this time, and not through fire, but through an act far more direct and far more dangerous than anything he had yet risked. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and hot, the kind of flat, hard light that left no shadows to hide in, and Coldwater Flat's small town hall filled to capacity well before the appointed hour, spilling out onto the boardwalk and into the dusty street beyond. More people gathered in one place than the town had seen since its founding. Odalys arrived early, with Sitting Elk, Ituha, Tokala, and a considerable portion of the council, along with Croft, weathered and grim-faced, and a still nervous Purnell, who kept glancing toward the door as though expecting Vantry's men to appear at any moment and drag him bodily from the proceedings. The crowd's reaction to the Apache delegation walking in together, unified, dignified, unhurried, was a study in contrasts. Some faces open with curiosity, some tight with old, unexamined prejudice. A few, mostly younger, mostly the children who'd grown up hearing whispered stories of the giant woman and the dying chief, wide-eyed with something closer to awe. Odalys felt every eye in the room measure her, the way eyes always measured her. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, the measuring did not shrink her. She stood at her full height, Sitting Elk on one side, Ituha on the other. And she did not duck her head, did not fold her shoulders inward the way she'd trained herself to do in crowded rooms her whole life. Vantry arrived precisely on time, immaculately dressed, his lawyer at his side, his composure so thoroughly intact that for one sick, sinking moment, Odalys wondered if all their evidence, all their careful weeks of building a case brick by brick, would simply slide off him the way water slides off oiled leather. He nodded politely to the room, took his seat, and when Whitlock called the hearing to order, Vantry's lawyer rose smoothly to offer an opening statement, painting his client as a hard-working rancher unfairly targeted by rumor, jealousy, and the opportunistic scheming of people. He did not say which people, but his meaning was unmistakable, who stood to gain considerably from muddying an honest man's reputation and disputing honestly held land. The room murmured, uncertain, some heads nodding along with the lawyer's smooth, reasonable-sounding words. Then Whitlock began calling witnesses. Doc Aldous went first, his testimony halting but honest, describing the strange arrangement of his single visit to Sitting Elk 2 years before, the fee paid by a rancher with no evident connection to the patient, the pressure, never spoken outright but unmistakably present, to declare the case hopeless. Croft followed, blunt and unbothered by Vantry's lawyer's attempts to rattle him, describing exactly what he'd seen the night of the fire, exactly which riders he'd recognized, exactly why a man with a 6-year-old grudge and nothing left to lose had no reason whatsoever to lie about any of it. The room's murmur shifted, growing heavier, more uneasy, as witness followed witness. The bank teller, nervous but resolute, describing the unusual transfer to the land office. The stable hand, recounting Dashiell's overheard orders. Each account small on its own, but accumulating, brick by careful brick, into something that could no longer be waved away as mere rumor or jealousy. Then Sitting Elk rose to speak. The room went utterly silent as he made his way to stand before the assembled crowd, his voice steady and clear, carrying the particular weight of a man who has survived what should have killed him and has chosen, deliberately, to spend that survival on truth rather than silence. He told them of the stakes he'd seen driven along the river, the surveyor's talk of railroad money, the raid that had followed 1 week later, the wound stitched wrong on purpose so that he would either die quietly or live too broken to speak. "I did not die," he said, his eyes moving slowly across the crowded room, resting for a moment on Odalys before continuing. "Because a woman this town has spent years measuring by her size instead of her character, rode 2 hours into a camp of people not her own, expecting nothing, and gave me back enough life to stand here today and finish what that fire failed to finish 2 years ago." A ripple moved through the crowd at that, shame in some faces, recognition in others, and Odalys felt her throat tighten as dozens of eyes shifted from Sitting Elk to find her standing at the back of the room, no longer measuring her size, but seeing, perhaps for the first time, something else entirely. Purnell testified last, his voice shaking but resolute, describing the letter, its discovery, his 2 years of guilty silence, and finally, the moment he'd decided he could not carry that silence any further. When Whitlock produced the letter itself, reading Vantry's own words aloud to the hushed room, words that spoke plainly, damningly, of a boundary line known to run one way and planned to be treated as though it ran another, for the sake of railroad money that would only materialize once the truth had been sufficiently buried, the room's composure broke entirely. Voices rose. Someone near the front shouted a question Vantry's lawyer scrambled unsuccessfully to intercept. Vantry himself, for the first time in the entire proceeding, showed a crack in his careful smoothness, a tightening around his eyes, a stillness in his hands that had, until that moment, rested with practiced ease on his knee. Whitlock let the room's noise crest and begin to settle before he spoke again, his voice cutting through the remaining murmur with flat, unhurried authority. "Mr. Vantry," he said, "you'll have your chance to answer every piece of this, through proper channels, in proper court. But I think this room has heard enough today to understand why I rode out here in the first place, and why I don't intend to let this matter quietly disappear back into whatever paperwork trick might have buried it before." Vantry rose slowly, and for a moment Odalys thought he might attempt one final, smooth deflection, some calm, reasonable-sounding explanation that might yet turn the room's sympathy back in his favor, the way he had turned so many rooms in his favor over the years, through nothing more than confident, unhurried courtesy. Instead, he looked once around the crowded hall, at the witnesses arrayed against him, at the letter in Whitlock's hand, at the unified, dignified presence of Sitting Elk's people standing together at the front of the room, at Odalys standing tall and unbowed at the back. and something in his composed face finally, visibly, gave way. He said nothing. He simply sat back down, his lawyer leaning close to whisper something urgent that Vantry did not appear to be listening to at all. And the silence that followed, the room's collective recognition that the smooth, untouchable rancher had, at last, run entirely out of smooth things to say, felt to Odalys like the loudest sound she had heard in the whole long ordeal. She did not yet know that this silence, this single moment of Vantry's composure finally cracking in front of the whole watching town, would become the story Coldwater Flat told and retold for years afterward. Not the fire, not the paperwork, not even the 60 riders on the ridge, but this. The moment a smooth man ran out of smoothness, in front of the very community he had spent a decade quietly, patiently using. She did not yet know that the hearing's aftermath would bring both justice and complication in equal measure, or that the quiet, earned peace she had begun to imagine for herself still lay some distance ahead, through consequences that would take weeks yet to fully settle. The days following the hearing moved with a strange, disorienting speed after the long, slow months that had preceded them. Marshal Whitlock, armed now with sworn testimony, physical evidence, and a town's worth of public witness that made quiet burial of the matter considerably harder than it might once have been, formally charged Vantry within the week, not merely with the paperwork fraud and land disputes that had first drawn attention, but, once federal investigators arrived to examine the fire 2 years prior in light of the new evidence, with charges considerably graver: conspiracy and complicity in the violence that had left Sitting Elk's people burned from their homes and their chief nearly dead. Vantry's lawyer fought hard, as smooth lawyers do, delaying and disputing and attempting every legal maneuver available to a wealthy man determined not to lose everything at once. But the weight of evidence, once fully assembled and publicly aired, proved too heavy even for the territory's more sympathetic judges to quietly set aside. By early autumn, Vantry's sprawling eastern spread had been seized pending trial. His foreman, Dashel, had fled the territory entirely, rather than face questioning about his own role in the fire and the intimidation of witnesses. And Vantry himself sat in the territorial jail, awaiting a trial that Whitlock assured everyone, grimly, would not be quick and would not be kind. The land itself, the disputed river boundary, the water rights, the grazing ground that had cost so much blood and fear to properly measure, was surveyed formally that autumn, with Sitting Elk himself present to walk the line alongside the territorial surveyor, confirming what the stone cairns had already stubbornly insisted upon through fire and threat alike. The true boundary ran precisely where his memory had always placed it, restoring to his people land that had been quietly, illegally grazed by Vantry's cattle for the better part of a decade. Odalys's own land office trouble evaporated within days of the hearing, the survey questions and back taxes quietly withdrawn once it became clear exactly whose influence had manufactured them in the first place, and Perrin Coates, the nervous young clerk who'd first delivered the notice, sought her out personally to apologize, his young face flushed with an embarrassment that seemed, to Odalys, genuinely felt rather than merely performed. "I didn't know," he told her, turning his hat over in his hands. "I mean, I suspected, maybe. But I didn't let myself look too hard at it, because looking too hard felt like it might cost me my position. I'm sorry for that. Truly." Odalys studied him for a moment, remembering her own months of fear and uncertainty, the countless small ways his hesitant, apologetic delivery of bad news had nonetheless still been bad news, still a weapon in Vantry's hand, even if Coates himself had not wielded it willingly. "You came to say so," she said finally, echoing, without quite meaning to, the words Sitting Elk had once offered Purnell beside a low fire in the dark.
That's what matters, in the end. Coates left looking lighter than he'd arrived, and Odalys found herself, in the weeks that followed, receiving similar visits more often than she might have expected. Townsfolk who had once measured her only by her size, now finding reasons to stop by her ranch with small offerings, an extra jar of preserves, an offer of help mending fence, awkward but sincere attempts at a kind of belated welcome that Odalys accepted with more grace than she might once have thought herself capable of. Took a public hearing and a federal conspiracy charge to get half this town to finally say a civil word to me, she remarked dryly to Ituha one evening, the two of them sharing coffee on Odalys's porch as the sun sank gold behind the ridge. Feels like I ought to be more grateful than I am. Ituha's mouth curved in that same private, knowing smile Odalys had come to treasure over the months of their friendship. Gratitude and patience are not the same thing, she said. You may accept their kindness without forgetting how long it took them to offer it. Both things can be true. Odalys considered that for a long moment, watching the light shift across the grass, and found she agreed completely that the townsfolk's belated warmth, however welcome, did not erase the years of measuring, mocking, careful cataloging that had come before it, and that she was under no obligation to pretend otherwise, simply because the ending, for once, had turned out kinder than she'd learned to expect. It was Tokala, arriving one crisp evening in early October with a message from Sitting Elk, who brought the news that finally, fully, let Odalys exhale the last of the tension she'd been carrying since that first knock on her door months before. The council has voted, he told her, dismounting with the easy grace she'd grown accustomed to seeing in him, to formally recognize you as a member of the community, not as a guest who visits, but as someone with standing, someone whose voice carries weight in matters that concern us. My grandfather asked me to tell you himself, but he also asked me to say that the council's vote was unanimous, and that it took considerably less debate than most matters the council usually argues over for hours. Odalys felt her eyes sting, and did not bother trying to hide it this time, standing on her own porch in the fading light with tears simply falling, unashamed, the way she had learned over these strange, transformative months that some things did not need to be hidden or apologized for after all. Tell him, she said, her voice rough, that I accept. And tell him, she paused, searching for words large enough to hold what she actually meant. Tell him that I have spent my whole life being looked at. This is the first time I've ever truly felt seen. Tokala nodded, something warm and understanding in his young face, and mounted back up to carry the message home through the gathering dusk, leaving Odalys alone once more on her porch, though the word alone, she realized, watching him ride off toward the darkening ridge, no longer fit the shape of her life quite the way it once had.
She did not yet know that the coming winter would bring its own quiet trials. Vantry's trial itself still pending, still requiring her testimony and Sitting Elk's and Croft's and Purnell's, a long, grinding process that would test everyone's patience through the cold months ahead. She did not yet know that spring, when it finally came, would bring with it a decision neither she nor anyone at the camp had yet begun to imagine, one that would reshape the very geography of her days. But she did know, standing on her porch in the fading golden light with the sting of grateful tears still wet on her face, that whatever trials remained ahead, she would not face them the way she had faced every trial before this one, alone, guarded, expecting nothing, bracing always for the next disappointment. She would face them seen. Winter settled over Coldwater Flat hard and early that year, the first frost arriving in late October and staying more or less until the trial finally concluded in the deep cold of January. It was exactly as Whitlock had warned, neither quick nor kind. Vantry's lawyer fought every inch of ground, disputing evidence, delaying proceedings, attempting at one point to argue that the treaty line itself had never been properly ratified and therefore carried no legal weight at all. An argument the territorial judge, a stern, unsentimental woman named Judge Constance Redfield, who had little patience for procedural games dressed up as principal, dismissed within a single afternoon of testimony. Odalys testified twice, once regarding the land office fraud and once, more difficult, regarding everything she had learned and pieced together in the months since first riding out to tend Sitting Elk's wound. She found, standing in the territorial courtroom under Judge Redfield's sharp, evaluating gaze, that the old instinct to shrink, to apologize for the space she took up simply by standing tall in a room, had grown considerably quieter than it once was. Not gone entirely. She suspected it might never be entirely gone. Old wounds healing slow the way Sitting Elk's own wound had healed slow. But quieter, manageable, no longer the loudest voice in her own head. Sitting Elk's testimony, delivered over 2 full days of grueling cross-examination, proved the trial's turning point. Vantry's lawyer attempted repeatedly to suggest the old chief's memory of events 2 years past might be unreliable, colored by grief, by pain, by the trauma of near death. A line of questioning that Sitting Elk met each time with the same calm, unshakable clarity, answering every challenge with such precise, consistent detail that even Judge Redfield, famously difficult to visibly impress, was seen to nod slightly at several points during his account. "I have had 2 years to consider every detail of that night," Sitting Elk told the courtroom, his voice carrying steady and clear across the packed room. "A man who believes he is dying examines his memories very carefully, wondering which ones he will carry into whatever comes next. I did not misremember what I saw. I have thought of little else, many long nights since." The courtroom, packed with spectators from 3 counties, including a considerable delegation from Coldwater Flat itself who had traveled the distance specifically to witness the proceedings, fell into the particular hush that accompanies testimony everyone present understands to be simply, unshakably true. Croft's testimony followed, blunt as ever, and Purnell's, still visibly ashamed but resolute. And finally, on the trial's last day, the letter itself was formally entered into evidence, read aloud in its entirety by the court clerk, Vantry's own carefully composed words condemning him more thoroughly than any witness's account alone could have managed. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty, on every count. Conspiracy, fraud, complicity in the violence that had left Sitting Elk's people burned and their chief nearly dead. Judge Redfield, in sentencing, spoke at some length about the particular cruelty of crimes committed through paperwork and quiet influence rather than open violence, noting that such crimes were, in her considerable experience, often more corrosive to a community's trust than any single violent act, precisely because they hid behind the appearance of order and law, rather than announcing themselves honestly as the theft and violence they actually were. Vantry received a sentence that would keep him confined for the better part of 2 decades, his remaining assets seized to satisfy restitution claims from every small rancher and homesteader his quiet scheming had ever touched. A list, it turned out, considerably longer than even Whitlock had initially suspected, stretching back years before Odalys or Sitting Elk had ever crossed his path. Odalys sat beside Sitting Elk and Ituha in the courtroom's front rows as the sentence was read, and felt, rather than triumph exactly, something quieter and more durable settle into her chest, the particular hard-won peace of watching a wrong finally, properly named and answered, not with vengeance, but with the slow, grinding, ultimately reliable weight of truth finally given room to stand. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the sharp cold of a January afternoon,
The assembled group from Coldwater Flat and from Sitting Elk's camp mingled together on the courthouse steps in a way that would have seemed 8 months before entirely unimaginable. Otis Kellerman shaking Tokala's hand with genuine warmth, Doc Aldous speaking quietly and apologetically with Ituha. Even Perrin Coates, still visibly uncertain of his welcome, offered a nod of acknowledgement from members of the council he had wronged unknowingly. "It is not tidy," Sitting Elk observes to Odalys, watching the scene with the particular weathered satisfaction of a man who had waited 2 years for this exact moment, without ever quite letting himself believe it would come. "Vantry's punishment does not return the 2 years my people lost, or the grazing land grazed bare while we waited, or the fear my grandchildren carried, not knowing whether I would live to see them grown. Justice rarely returns what was taken. It only marks clearly that the taking was wrong." "Not every ending needs to be tidy," Odalys said slowly, the words arriving in her as though she had known them a long while, without ever quite finding cause to say them aloud. "To still be an ending." Sitting Elk looked at her for a long moment, something warm and approving in his weathered face, and nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "That is exactly it." They stood together a while longer on the courthouse steps, watching the strange, hopeful mingling of two communities that had, 8 months before, barely acknowledged each other's existence except through fear and rumor. And Odalys found herself thinking, not for the first time that winter, of how strange and enormous the distance was between the woman who had ridden alone into a war camp with nothing but clean cloth and half-remembered medical knowledge, and the woman standing here now, surrounded by people who had chosen her, deliberately and repeatedly, through fire and fear and a long, grinding trial, as someone worth standing beside. She did not yet know that the following spring would bring a decision that neither she nor Sitting Elk's council had yet begun to discuss openly, though the first quiet seeds of it had already unknowingly been planted in months of shared meals and root-grinding silences, and small, deliberate acts of trust extended and honored in turn. She did not yet know that the quiet, earned peace she had found this winter was not, in fact, the end of her story, but only the ground upon which its true resolution would finally, slowly, be built. Spring came slower than expected that year, the frost lingering stubborn into April, the grass along the river bend scorched black the previous summer, pushing up new and tentative and green, as though the land itself needed extra time to trust that the fire truly would not return. Odalys spent the early months of the new year in the quiet, unhurried rhythm that had come to define her life since the trial's conclusion, tending her cattle, working her garden, riding to the camp several times weekly, not out of necessity now, but out of the simple, accumulated habit of friendship, a habit that had, somewhere in the past year, become as essential to her days as splitting wood at dawn had once been. It was Ituha who first raised the idea that would come to reshape the geography of Odalys's life, broaching it carefully one evening in early March as the two of them sat grinding roots by lamplight, a ritual that had long since stopped requiring any particular reason beyond the simple pleasure of each other's company. "The council has been discussing something," Ituha said, not quite looking up from her work, in a tone Odalys had learned, over their long friendship, meant the older woman was choosing her words with unusual care. "The land recovered through the trial, the true boundary, restored, includes ground along the river that would suit cattle well, better grazing than much of what remains higher in the hills, where we have kept our herds these past years out of necessity rather than preference." Odalys set down the root she'd been working, listening carefully, sensing that whatever Ituha was building toward mattered a great deal. "There has been talk," Ituha continued, "of whether it might serve everyone well if a rancher with real knowledge of cattle and real trust already built with this council, might be invited to run a herd on that recovered ground, in partnership, rather than the land sitting idle while my people relearn skills we set aside a generation ago, when the buffalo stopped coming and cattle became, whether we liked it or not, the animal that would keep us fed. Odalys felt her breath catch, understanding, slowly, the shape of what was actually being offered. "You're asking if I'd move my herd," she said carefully, "onto land that belongs to your people." "I am asking," Ituha said, finally looking up, her dark eyes steady and warm, "if you would consider building something with us, rather than simply visiting it. My brother has spoken of this with the full council, not merely with me. The vote, when it came, was not unanimous this time. Some among us still carry old wounds regarding white settlement on any land we have fought to keep, wounds I do not think it fair to dismiss simply because you personally have earned trust. But the vote passed, comfortably, and my brother asked that I be the one to bring it to you, since he believed, correctly, I think, that you would hear it more easily from someone who has ground roots beside you many long evenings, rather than from a formal council announcement." Odalys sat with the offer for a long moment, turning it over the way she turned over any decision of real weight, testing its shape, its cost, its true meaning beneath the generous surface of it. "Your land," she said finally. "Your name on it. I wouldn't want anyone thinking this was some backdoor way of a white woman claiming ground that was fought and bled for by people who aren't me." Ituha's mouth curved in the small, private smile Odalys had come to treasure. "That concern," she said, "is precisely why the council trusts you with this. A man like Vantry would never have thought to ask that question. He would simply have taken, and called the taking generosity, and expected gratitude for it besides." "The land stays ours," Ituha continued, "recorded, formally, with the Territorial Land Office now that the boundary is properly surveyed and can no longer be quietly moved by a man with a shovel and bad intentions. You would run cattle on it in partnership, a share of the herd's growth going to the council's own use, feeding families, trading for goods we need, and the rest remaining yours, as payment for knowledge and labor my people are still relearning. It is not charity in either direction. It is what my brother would call a debt properly structured, rather than a gift given once and then forgotten." Odalys thought of her own ranch, the fence lines Sitting Elk's people had helped her raise, the well they'd dug, the cabin she'd built, board by board, with blistered palms and a stubbornness nobody had asked her to have. She thought of 4 years of solitude, of a life built carefully around the expectation of being always, ultimately, alone. And she thought of 60 riders on a ridge, and a child settling trustingly into her lap, and root-grinding silences that had become the fullest conversations of her adult life, and a whole community that had chosen her, deliberately and repeatedly, not despite the size of her, but without ever once making that size the whole of what they saw. "I'd need to keep my own place too," she said slowly. "It's mine. I built it. I'm not looking to give it up." "No one is asking you to," Ituha said. "The council imagines you dividing your time, as you already do, between the two, though I suspect, if I know my own heart in this matter as well as I believe I do, that the balance of your days will shift naturally toward wherever your herd and your friends both happen to be grazing." Odalys laughed then, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, and Ituha laughed with her, and the two of them sat together by lamplight for a long while afterward, not discussing terms or logistics any further that evening, simply enjoying the particular, hard-won pleasure of two people who had built, slowly and deliberately, brick by careful brick, a trust sturdy enough to hold decisions this large without either of them needing to rush toward finalizing them. It took another month of careful discussion,
with the full council, with Sitting Elk, with Tokala, who would be the one working most directly alongside Odalys, given his own growing interest in cattle ranching as a skill worth adding to his people's survival, before the partnership was formally agreed and recorded, properly, with the Territorial Land Office, in a document that named both Sitting Elk's people and Odalys Marsh with equal weight and equal standing. A piece of paper that, unlike the fraudulent notices Vantry had once used against her, represented not a threat, but a genuine, mutual claim built on trust rather than trickery. By the time the document was finalized, the frost had fully broken, the grass along the river bend had grown thick and green, and entirely unmarked by the fire that had once threatened to consume it. And Odalys found herself, on a warm afternoon in early May, driving the first small portion of her herd, a dozen head, a careful beginning rather than a wholesale move, onto the recovered grazing land along the river, with Tokala riding beside her, learning the particular rhythms of cattle work with the same careful, attentive seriousness he'd once brought to watching her clean his grandfather's wound. "You'll want to watch this one," she told him, nodding toward a stubborn young steer that had already, twice, attempted to wander off from the small herd's careful line.
"Thinks he knows better than the rest where the good grass is."
"Sounds like someone I know," Tokala said, deadpan, and Odalys huffed out a surprised laugh, understanding perfectly well that he meant her, that this was exactly the kind of dry, understated joke that had become, over their long months of friendship, their particular way of saying things too tender to say plainly. They worked together through the long golden afternoon, driving cattle onto new grass, the river running bright and full beside them, the hills rising green and unburned in every direction. And Odalys found herself thinking, not for the first time, but perhaps for the first time without any accompanying ache of disbelief, that this exact moment, this particular blend of hard work and easy company, and land held in trust between two peoples who had, not so long ago, been strangers to each other, was what she had once folded up small and put away, believing it was not meant for a woman built the way she was. She had been wrong. Or perhaps, she thought, watching Tokala laugh at the stubborn steer's third escape attempt, she had simply been waiting for the right people to prove her wrong. And it had taken longer than it should have, and cost more than it should have. But it had arrived all the same, real and solid, and entirely hers to keep. She did not yet know, that golden May afternoon, exactly how the rest of her life would unfold from this new foundation. How many more seasons of shared grazing land and root-grinding evenings and dry, understated jokes lay ahead. How Sitting Elk's health would continue slowly strengthening until, by the following autumn, he would walk the recovered boundary line unassisted, marking it once more. This time, not out of desperate necessity, but out of quiet, celebratory ritual. She did not yet know how many townsfolk from Coldwater Flat would, in the years to come, follow the same slow path from wary distance to genuine friendship that Otis and Doc Aldous had walked first. Or how the story of the giant woman and the dying chief would be told and retold, softening at its rough edges the way stories do, until it became, eventually, simply the story of how two communities learned to become one, neither erasing the other, both made larger for the joining. But she knew, standing in the golden light, with cattle grazing peacefully on ground reclaimed from fire and fraud and 2 years of buried fear, that whatever came next, she would not face it the way she had faced every year before the fire, in that first firelit scene that had, unknowingly, set her whole strange, transformative journey into motion. She would not face it alone. The seasons turned,
as seasons do, indifferent to the particular dramas of any single year. And Coldwater Flat settled slowly into a new shape around the partnership that had once seemed, to most who first heard of it, like the strangest arrangement the territory had ever produced. By the following summer, the arrangement between Odalys and Sitting Elk's council had proven itself sturdy enough that a handful of other small ranchers, watching the recovered grazing land thrive under careful, shared stewardship, had begun quietly approaching the council themselves with similar proposals. Some driven by genuine goodwill, others, Odalys suspected privately, driven mostly by the plain economic sense of good grazing land properly managed. But she found, turning the question over the way she turned over most things, that she did not much mind the mixture of motives, so long as the arrangements themselves were built honestly, on paper that meant what it said, rather than paper designed to obscure and deceive, the way Vantry's had.
Vantry himself remained, as far as anyone in Coldwater Flat knew, confined in the territorial prison, his name spoken less and less as the months passed, the particular gravity he had once held over the region's affairs fading the way such gravity always fades once its source is removed from circulation. Not forgotten entirely, the scars of what he'd caused too real and too lasting for that, but no longer looming, no longer the shadow beneath which every small rancher's fortune had once quietly, precariously rested. Odalys's own life had settled into a rhythm she could not, 4 years before, have imagined wanting, let alone having. Mornings split between her own ranch and the growing herd along the river, afternoons that increasingly included Tokala's steady, attentive company as he grew more confident in the work. Evenings that alternated between her own quiet cabin and the warmer, noisier gathering of Sitting Elk's camp, where Ituha's root-grinding, lamp-lit hours had expanded, gradually, into something closer to a standing invitation to whatever meal happened to be cooking. The fearless little girl who had first climbed uninvited into her lap that afternoon of 60 riders had grown, over the intervening seasons, into something like a devoted shadow whenever Odalys visited the camp, trailing her through chores with an endless stream of questions about cattle, about ranching, about whether it was true that Odalys could lift a full-grown steer if she truly wanted to, a claim Odalys neither confirmed nor denied, preferring to let the girl's wide-eyed wonder remain productively unresolved. "You're going to run out of patience with her eventually," Tokala observed one evening, watching the girl chatter at Odalys's heels as they walked back from the river pasture. "I don't think I will," Odalys said, and found, saying it, that she meant it entirely. She had spent so many years bracing against a world that measured her only by her size, had trained herself so thoroughly out of wanting the ordinary noise and warmth of a full life, that she had nearly forgotten how much simple, uncomplicated pleasure there was to be found in a child's unguarded trust, in being followed not out of fear or curiosity about her strangeness, but out of the plain, straightforward delight of being liked. There were harder days, too, of course, days when old wounds among the council members who had voted against the partnership resurfaced in careful, pointed questions about whether trust extended too readily might yet prove costly again. Days when Coldwater Flat's slower, more grudging warmth curdled back, briefly, into old suspicion, usually when some new rumor or misunderstanding traveled faster than the truth could catch it. A difficult stretch in late summer when a dispute over water rights, unrelated to Vantry entirely, tested the young partnership's resilience and required weeks of careful, patient council discussion before a fair resolution emerged. But these difficulties, Odalys found, no longer carried the particular sharp loneliness that difficulty had always carried for her before. She faced them now with people beside her. Sitting Elk's steady, weathered wisdom, Ituha's sharp clarity, Tokala's growing confidence, and, increasingly, a handful of Coldwater Flat's own townsfolk who had learned, slowly, to extend the same trust the council had once extended to her. It was Otis Kellerman, of all people,
who put words to the change most plainly, one afternoon in the mercantile as Odalys loaded supplies for both her own ranch and the growing partnership along the river. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said, shaking his head with the particular wonder of a man who had himself spent years contributing unthinkingly to the very isolation he now marveled at seeing dissolved. "This town used to look at you like you were some kind of curiosity. Now half of Coldwater Flat asks after you like your kin."
Odalys considered that for a moment, weighing it the way she weighed most things now, carefully, without either false modesty or bitter dismissal. "Took them long enough," she said, but there was no real edge in it, only a kind of tired, hard-won honesty, the acknowledgement of a debt that had been slow to pay but had eventually been paid all the same. "Yes," Otis agreed, without defensiveness, which surprised her, and which she appreciated more than she let on. "It did. I'm sorry for the part I played in that, the slowness of it. Man doesn't always see his own blindness until something forces the light in sideways." She nodded, accepting the apology the way she'd learned, over the past 2 years, to accept most sincere things offered to her. Plainly, without excessive grace or excessive suspicion, simply taking what was honestly given and letting it settle into the larger, more complicated truth of a life that had, finally, room enough to hold both old hurt and new belonging, without either one canceling the other out. Autumn came again, the second autumn since the trial, and Sitting Elk, true to the promise Odalys had watched form in him that golden May afternoon a year and a half before, walked the full boundary line of the recovered territory unassisted, Ituha and Tokala at his sides, Odalys walking with them, the whole council following behind in a procession that had none of the grim urgency of the cairn-building expedition years before, and all of the quiet, celebratory dignity of a people marking, formally, the wholeness of what had been threatened and was now, at last, secure. At the boundary's final marker, the same cairn that had stood scorched but unmoved through the fire, weathered now by 2 more years of sun and frost, but still solid, still standing exactly where it had first been placed, Sitting Elk stopped and turned to address the gathered procession, his voice carrying clear and strong across the autumn air in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the labored, dying breath Odalys had first knelt beside in a smoke-filled lodge years before. "This stone," he said, resting one weathered hand against the cairn's rough, gray surface, "was raised in fear, in the dark, by people who understood that truth needed something heavier than memory to protect it. It has stood through fire. It has stood through a trial that tested the patience of everyone gathered here. It stands now, simply, as what it always was, a marker of a line that was always true, no matter how hard some men worked to make the world forget it." He looked around the gathered crowd, resting his gaze, at the last, on Odalys. "We do not mark this boundary today because it was ever truly in doubt," he said. "We mark it because a woman who owed us nothing chose, once, to believe that a dying man's life was worth saving, and, in saving it, made it possible for the truth this stone represents to finally, fully, be spoken aloud." Odalys felt the familiar sting of tears rise, unashamed now, the way she had learned they need not be hidden, and found Ituha's hand finding hers in the small crowd, warm and steady, the way it had found hers on that very first afternoon of 60 riders, years and worlds away from where she now stood. She thought, in that quiet moment, of the woman she had been, splitting wood alone at dawn, ducking through doorways built for smaller bodies, folding away every ordinary hope, because the world had taught her, over and over, that hope was not extended to a woman built the way she was. She thought of how far that woman had traveled, not through the country, though she had traveled that too, 2 valleys over and back again more times than she could easily count, but through the slower, harder country of learning to be seen. The sun was beginning its long autumn descent by the time the procession made its way back toward the camp, gold and orange spreading wide across a sky big enough, finally, to hold everything Odalys had once believed too much for any single life to contain. Grief and joy both. Loneliness transformed into belonging. A family found rather than born into. A debt of life repaid not once, but continuously, in the accumulating currency of shared seasons and shared work and shared silence. She walked beside Sitting Elk and Ituha and Tokala, the little girl who had once climbed fearlessly into her lap, now walking just ahead, chattering with a friend about the cattle grazing peacefully in the golden distance. And Odalys understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at the end of a very long road, that she had arrived, at last, exactly where she was always meant to be. Not despite the size of her, not despite everything the world had once found too much about her, but because of it. Because she had never once made herself smaller to fit a world too narrow to hold her properly, and had found, in the end, people whose world was large enough to need no shrinking at all. The dusk settled soft and purple over the hills, 2 communities walking home together, beneath a sky wide enough for both of them. And somewhere behind them, unmoved and unmovable, the old stone marker stood exactly where truth had always placed it, waiting quietly for whatever seasons still lay ahead.